Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Perspectives in Military History Lecture Series for March 2009. This evening, it is our pleasure to welcome this year's Harold K. Johnson Visiting Professor of Military History, Dr. Mark Grimsley. Professor Grimsley is currently on leave from The Ohio State University, where he teaches American military history with an emphasis on the Civil War. He is the author of The Hard Hand of War, Union Military Policy Towards Southern Civilians, 1861 to 1865, which won the Lincoln Prize. His other work includes Warfare in the Western World, Civilians in the Path of War, and Keep Moving On, the Virginia Campaign, May to June 1864. He also wrote Gettysburg, A Battlefield Guide with Brooks D. Simpson, and Shiloh, A Battlefield Guide with Stephen E. Woodworth. He is currently at work writing a book on the connections between the 1864 military and political campaigns for the Pivotal Movements in American Military History series, published by the Oxford University Press. Tonight, however, he presents a significantly different perspective on American military history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Mark Grimsley.
Well, good evening. Thanks very much for coming out on such a wonderful evening. If I didn't have to be presenting, I wouldn't be here. It is just a really, really nice place. I am Mark Grimsley. I am Seminar 16. Go Raiders. How many Seminar 16 people do we have? All right. Okay. Outstanding. All right. Bit of housekeeping before I get started. I have some money up here, and hopefully I won't have to do anything with it, but just in case. I'm a relaxed speaker. I like talking to people. I get excited and animated when I'm enjoying what I'm talking about. And one of the things that is sort of a rental side effect of being here in a military environment for the first time in a number of years is that my vocabulary has gotten really very coarse. It has. And this is actually a non-trivial consideration for me. And so this sometimes happens back at Ohio State as well, not as badly. But one of the things I've learned to do over the years is I tell my students, it's like, okay, look, I'm allowed the occasional damn and hell, but if I say anything stronger, first person to raise their hand gets $1. And if I drop the F-bomb, then they get $20. Now, back in a civilian environment, the $20 is a joke, but not so much tonight. So I'm just, letting you all know. And actually, because this could happen, because I don't want to have to leave the lecture and so forth, I need somebody to. Steve, would you hold the money? So, Captain Knott. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I was at the Joint Pub. That's something else I've been doing a lot this year is drinking. I honestly, I have not drunk so much beer since my graduate school days in London, and it's just phenomenal. Yeah, go Raiders. But I was at the Joint Pub a couple weeks ago, and this talk of mine has been very well advertised at the Army War College, and a War College student came up to me and mentioned that I was giving a controversial talk. And I didn't ask him what he meant by controversial because I thought he might tell me. But I've been thinking about it since then, the different ways in which this topic could be considered to be controversial. And so, inevitably, of course, I am an academic historian in the military environment, and so one thing one has to worry about, I guess, is the idea that this is going to be a load of liberal stuff, and maybe so, because the first controversial point I think about my talk tonight is that the civil rights movement may not at first glance seem to be an insurgency. Why? And as I was thinking about the possible reasons one might come up with this, I came up with three. One, you could say, well, it wasn't war, so therefore how could it be an insurgency? You could say it's nonviolent, so how could it be war or an insurgency? And the civil rights movement had strong support from the U.S. government. So how could the civil rights movement be an insurgency? And in fact, I'm not the first person, it turns out, to have thought about the civil rights movement as an insurgency. As far as I know, the one person who's done this systematically before me is Al Nofot, who's a reasonably well-known strategic analyst. And some years ago, when he was looking for historical antecedents to what's now called fourth-generation warfare, he came up with the civil rights movement. But the insurgents in his scenario were the KKK and paramilitary organizations and so forth, because he was assuming that the federal government was in the bag for the civil rights movement, and so the resistors were the KKK and the vigilante resistors and so on. My take, as we're going to find out, is different. I agree with Al that it's an insurgency. I disagree with him about why it's an insurgency. Let's take the first objection. It's not war. Well, many of you in the room may have heard of Karl von Clausewitz. He's on the ceiling at the joint pub, along with an obscenity. Clausewitz famously says, war is a continuation of politics by other means. Well, let's just take that as our starting point. Pretty uncontroversial in these parts. Well, there's at least two basic kinds of wars. This is according to General Paul von Riper recently, who's just like, hybrid war and this and that. Come on, let's forget it. There's two basic kinds of war. Essentially, wars of maneuver, wars of insurgency. So we'll go with that. And wars of insurgency are often waged by groups that are excluded from the realm of normal politics. So it's not. So it is a variation on continuation of politics, because what these groups are trying to do is to intrude, to get themselves within the realm of normal politics, and this was true of Negroes in the American South. And by the way, word on terminology, because language actually matters in terms of when you look at the civil rights movement. Civil rights historians have mentioned this to me several times. There is actually a significant shift in the language during the course of the movement from Negro, which was the term that we now say African Americans in the civil rights movement used to describe themselves. And about 1965, that shifts to black. And I'm going to follow that convention here. I will talk in terms of the Negro civil rights movement until about 65, and then I'll shift to black, which is the way that civil rights historians commonly do it themselves. Few Negroes in the Deep South could even vote, and nowhere in the South did Negroes have the ability to influence legislation and law enforcement through normal politics. And therefore, the civil rights movement was an attempt to gain access to the political process by coercion. If it were done with guns, nobody would hesitate to think of it as an insurgency. So that gets us to the second objection. It was nonviolent. Well, this overlooks the fact that segregationist regimes did not hesitate to use coercion, the threat of violence, and outright violence to maintain in position a Jim Crow regime that had been in place the better part of a century by the time the modern civil rights movement occurred. And there was, on the part of the segregationist governments, a lot of police violence and a tacit endorsement of paramilitary and vigilante violence. And so the civil rights movement was often lethal. It's estimated, actually I think this is an actual count, that between 1960 and 1965, at least 60 civil rights activists were killed. To say nothing of Negroes who attempted to exercise their rights, who were killed for exercising their rights, or who were killed simply to maintain terror. States had a monopoly on violence. Negroes were a minority in the South. And the federal government would have assisted in destroying an armed insurgency. And so Negroes used tactics well calculated to overthrow the enemy's will, and they did so very adroitly. But they had to use a certain kind of tactics to deal successfully with this kind of opponent. And so if reframed as strategy rather than violence, this looks a lot more like insurgency. Okay. So, strategy and tactics had to be effective against an opponent that had a monopoly on state violence, tacitly encouraged paramilitary and vigilante violence, and also, and this is something I got from Al Nofi, I think it's an interesting expression, I think it originates with him, also made systematic use of what he calls lawfare. What is that? That is the exploitation of the legal system to intimidate, block, and if necessary, imprison opponents. And so what you have here on the right are protesters in Birmingham in May 1963 have been rounded up by the police and placed in a compound. And by the way, they're placed there because the jails at that point were overflowing already. In the middle, that is the mugshot of Stokely Carmichael, the Student Nonviolent and Coordinated Committee, held by the Mississippi Sovereign Commission until their records were open to the public. Many of them are digitized now and available online, but they kept tabs on him. And the guy on the left, I think, is sort of the poster child for lawfare, because he was present in Holly Springs, Mississippi on Freedom Day when he was trying to register voters. This is 1964, summer 1964. And if you notice, he has like a placard, not much larger than our identification, things we card around at the War College, and it says, voter registration worker. He was arrested and charged with carrying not identification, but carrying a placard. It's under some local ordinance was a crime, punishable in his case by 5 days in jail. And by the way, didn't go to court. He was just held 5 days in jail until he could finally get out on bond. This was the kind of stuff these people were routinely used to block their opponents. So on top of everything else, you've got this lawfare. So, but again, nonviolent, but if you reframe all this in terms of strategy rather than thinking in terms of violence, this looks more like an insurgency. And then, of course, there is another military theorist commonly used at the Army War College, Sun Tzu. And a lot of people read Sun Tzu, apparently. And apparently, but it's actually pronounced correctly, Sun Tzu, right? That's something else I'd learned in Seminar 16 this year. But Sun Tzu, for to win 100 victories and 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. So here's Sun Tzu saying that war can be nonviolent, and insurgency can be nonviolent, and nonetheless meet his criteria. And it can indeed be, the acme of the practice of war. But there's another thing too, which is that the movement was not entirely nonviolent. And recent scholarship has looked seriously at Negro self-defense before 1965, before the Black Panthers. And I'll talk more about that later. The third objection, and this really kind of gets me into the heart of the discussion, because to me, the major objection to the idea that this was an insurgency is that the civil rights movement had strong support from the U.S. government. And there are certainly reasons to think so. I mean, if you read American history textbooks, and by the way, Ms. Christine Goodfellow, Colonel Krusty Goodfellow's wife, was good enough to get me a couple of high school textbooks that are being used at Boiling Springs High School, Go Bubblers. And I looked at them, and I looked at some other textbooks and so forth, and really, if you read them, they convey the impression that the federal government was very much on the side of the civil rights movement, because they moved fairly rapidly from Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 to Eisenhower's sending in elements of the 101st Airborne in 1957 to Little Rock, and also federalizing the Arkansas Guard. Sounds like, that when they were trying to integrate, or when Governor Orwell Falvus was trying to stop the integration of Central High School in Little Rock. So that looks like federal government's in the can for civil rights movement. You have federal marshals and the Department of Justice making sure that James Meredith was able to integrate the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, in 1962. In June 1963, President Kennedy gives a major address on television that basically announces that he's going to try to get passage of a major civil rights bill. That certainly sounds like the Kennedy administration was in favor of the civil rights movement. Here is President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then finally, in popular imagination, there is a very well-done drama, Mississippi Burning. How many people have seen the film Mississippi Burning? Okay. Directed by Alan Parker, Gene Hackman, Willem Dafoe. Hackman and Dafoe play two dedicated FBI agents, very contrasting styles, but both of them are on the hunt for the killers of 3 civil rights workers. And it conveys an impression that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was very much on the side of the civil rights movement as well. When this film came out in 1988, Gene Hackman was on Nightline, talking about with Ted Koppel and so forth. He was very pleased with himself. And as the drama, it's great. But they also had veterans of the civil rights movement on there, and they were livid. Because that picture of the FBI in the tank for the civil rights movement just ain't so, and they knew it. And the picture of the federal government being in the tank for the civil rights movement just wasn't so either. So, to begin to make a case for insurgency, you have to accurately understand the stance of the U.S. government. And this is really of central importance, I think, to understand the whole thing. Remember, first of all, that when you're talking about the federal government, you're not talking about a monolithic whole. You're beginning with 3 different branches. So let's look at what each branch is doing in turn. Well, on the one hand, you have the Supreme Court, which in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education determined that separate but equal in schools was inherently unequal, overruled it, and ruled that schools had to be desegregated, had to be integrated. Took 2 years for them to come up with a second decision, usually called Brown 2, in which they talked about how you were going to implement this decision. And the delay, the 2-year delay, coupled with an eventual call for all deliberate speed, remember that phrase in the Brown 2 decision, emboldened segregationists. It was practically a license, in their eyes, to find reasons for delay. And after 10 years after the Brown decision, the Deep South remained almost completely segregated, and real desegregation did not begin to really hit its stride until about 1970 with a further Supreme Court decision. This on the right is a 1960 cartoon by Bill Mauldin. Many of you will know the Joe and Willie cartoons of the Second World War. And what he's talking about here is the slow progress of school desegregation. You've got these little kids inch by inch trying to creep through the door labeled school segregation. Then you have the executive branch. Presidency, of course, responsible for enforcing the law. President Eisenhower, shown here in 1952, with the head attorney for the sort of the pro-segregation part of the Brown versus Board of Education case. This is the lead counsel on the right. Eisenhower put Warren on the Supreme Court Justice and was surprised to find that Warren put together a unanimous opinion in favor of desegregation, striking down Plessy versus Ferguson. He considered the Brown decision misguided. He thought that any attempt to change society in this kind of way was just plain nuts, that you couldn't, in effect, legislate such sweeping changes in society. He thought that the enforcement of the decision should be left up to the states. And so he actually did nothing when Texas and Mississippi resisted integration. And that, in turn, emboldened Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, to resist desegregation in his own state. In fact, practically forced him to resist it, because how else could he explain to his white constituents why he was desegregating when Texas and Mississippi weren't. The federal government was leaving them alone. And Faubus's blunders, he really overplayed his hand in a bad way, forced Eisenhower to act. But what Eisenhower did, when he actually sent in federal troops and when he federalized the Arkansas National Guard, he considered it the most distasteful decision of his presidency. And it's also worthy of note that the federal government intervened to get 9 children into a high school. Didn't question the fact that many hundreds of Negro children were successfully intimidated into not trying to integrate the high school in the first place. And they gave only sketchy protection to the 9 who did, who went through a year of just, systematic humiliation, petty and not so petty slights, and so on all the way through. Well, that's Eisenhower. What about JFK? JFK was equivocal. As a Democrat, he wanted to maximize Negro support and therefore gave symbolic or rhetorical support to the civil rights movement. But he was usually more concerned to prevent the defection of the southern wing of the Democratic Party, of which more in a moment. And he sometimes seemed as skeptical as Eisenhower about the possibility of change in a racist culture. Kennedy was told one time that African diplomats, not African American diplomats, but African diplomats from Africa were traveling, they were complaining because they were traveling from New York City to Washington, D.C., and they were finding that they were not being served at restaurants and so forth along the main highway and this kind of thing. And JFK wanted to put a stop to it. Not a stop to the bad behavior on the part of the restaurants, but a stop to African diplomats traveling from New York to D.C. on the ground, by land. He said, they ought to fly instead. He said, you have to be crazy to do that. So JFK is not in the tank for civil rights movement to the degree that one might suppose. And he consistently urged Negro activists to delay or curtail activities. The Freedom Rides, for instance, came on the eve of a major summit, and he didn't want it to be an international embarrassment. The March on Washington in 1963 that eventuated the I Have a Dream speech, he questioned. And pressure was brought to bear on the march to tone it down and to remove some of the messages and so forth that were going to be brought apart, especially a call for economic justice and so forth was squelched. More particularly, JFK, through his brother RFK, the Attorney General, authorized FBI wiretaps on Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders. And this raises the issue of J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the main federal law enforcement agency. Hoover was deeply racist, certain that the civil rights movement was deeply infiltrated by communists. He despised King. He publicly called him the most dangerous Negro in America. He publicly called him a notorious liar. The FBI not only tapped the phones of civil rights movement leaders and workers, but bugged offices and hotel rooms. They got evidence that King was not a communist, but rather a philanderer, which he was. They assembled taped excerpts of his assignations in hotel rooms and sent them to King anonymously, along with a note that he was a fraud with only one way out, obviously suicide. Coretta King actually received this package sent anonymously from Florida, but sent ultimately by the FBI, opened the package, and King listened to it with her. It was been a really difficult moment in their marriage, to say the least, and could pick up at least 3 locations where he had been by background noises and so forth. So it's very clear that only someone with a tremendous span of control, was behind this thing. So the FBI agents, they were down there in the South during voter registration drives and so forth, but they were down there monitoring civil rights activities. And they would see illegal segregationist activities, and they just took notes. And this is one of the things that just infuriated civil rights activists in the years following, when Mississippi Burning came out, because that was their recollection of FBI agents in the South. And then, within a few weeks of Martin Luther King's death, this appears in a CIA summary of the FBI's views on Martin Luther King. And according to the FBI, Dr. King is regarded in communist circles as, quote, a genuine Marxist-Leninist who is following the Marxist-Leninist line. Okay, so there we have the executive branch. Equivocal, at best, and the chief law enforcement agency arguably antagonistic toward the civil rights movement. Then we have Congress. And I looked at the 89th Congress, which was the Congress that came out right after the Brown decision, and I noted that in the former Confederate states, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. 43% of House Democrats came from the former Confederate states. 45% of Senate Democrats came from the former Confederate states. If you add the border states, West Virginia I threw in for this purpose is West Virginia, but also Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, as if it counts. That brings it up to 55% of the House, 60% of the Senate. So the federal government's in the tank for the civil rights movement, an unequivocal supporter? Probably not, especially when you take into account the Southern Manifesto. Few congressmen were really interested in civil rights, and 101 congressmen signed a Southern Manifesto masterminded by Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia and Senator Russell of Georgia. This came out when the Brown II decision came out in 1956, and these are two United States senators leading a charge that basically says that the decision of the Supreme Court case and the public school cases is a clear abuse of judicial power. It climaxes a trend in the federal judiciary undertaking to legislate and derogation of the authority of Congress and to encroach upon the reserved rights of the states and the people. So you've got that. And Congress, when it moved on civil rights, there was a Civil Rights Act that nobody's ever heard of that came out in 1957. The reason why you haven't heard of it is because it was basically gutted of its teeth before it was passed. It took until mid-1964, 10 years after the Brown decision, to come up with a Civil Rights Act that was a serious blow to segregation, and then only after a protracted filibuster. Okay. Before we move away from the federal government, obviously we need to take a look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the Senate Majority Leader in the late 1950s and one of only 3 senators who did not, from the South, who did not sign the Southern Manifesto. Al Gore Sr. was one. Estes Kefauver was the other. It's because they had national aspirations for political office, thought might be a bad idea. But he was the one who basically got the Civil Rights Act of 57 watered down to the degree that he did. And when he became president, he was much more interested in civil rights. That cannot be gainsaid. But that was in considerable measure because the civil rights movement by then had made so many gains that by 1964 he thought it would be a winning issue. But even then, like JFK, he tried to get Martin Luther King to slow down. He told Martin Luther King, for instance, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, that to pursue a Voting Rights Act was premature. And he should stop. He should cut it out. The civil rights movement that forced him to get that bill through by direct action. So, civil rights movement as an insurgency. By the way, that's Johnson laying down the law to Martin Luther King there. Too early. So the civil rights movement, I want to say, is not inevitable. The triumph of it is not inevitable the way the textbooks portray. It was, on the contrary, beatable. And white Southerners had ample reason to think they could fend off desegregation. And I just sat down and put together a list of them, and without too much trouble, I came up with a bunch. First, white conservatives have prevailed during Reconstruction, when last time the federal government had really tried it. People thought in terms of an analog to prohibition, that it was futile to legislate cultural behavior, and so if any gains that were made would be rescinded. They knew that they had allies in the executive branch. They knew that presidential will was questionable. They had a substantial grip on congressional power. We've seen that. They found it easy to exploit Cold War fears that the civil rights movement was riddled with communists, and this was a constant refrain throughout the civil rights movement, and many people believed it. Most whites within the South, of course, opposed desegregation. White moderates in the South who were interested in moving on it, their support for moving on it was tepid, whereas the extremists were very highly mobilized. Most whites outside the South were complacent about the pace of desegregation. I'll show you a couple of Gallup polls real quick. June 23rd, 1961, approval rate of the Brown decision. Nationally, 62% approved, 33% disapproved, 5% had no opinion. Okay. Still a substantial disapproval rate nationally. Here are the Gallup polls on the question, do you think the Kennedy administration is pushing racial integration too fast or not fast enough? This is nationally. In 1962, 42% are saying too fast. In October 1963, and this is after, October 13th, this is after the desegregation of the University of Alabama. This is after Birmingham, which we'll get to in a moment, but everybody, I think, is familiar with the fire hoses, the strong-arm tactics used in Birmingham. This is after the church bombing in Birmingham that killed those 4 little children. After all of this, 50%, the number of Americans who think that the Kennedy administration is pushing too fast, actually is higher. So, civil rights movement looked to be beatable for those reasons and a couple of others. Constitutional division of power within the federal system gave state governments a lot of control. And so when we're thinking about an insurgency, the target of the insurgency is to destroy the power of these segregationist state governments. These are the governments that need to be overthrown. Okay? And these state governments retain a great deal of control under the federal system. And then finally, there were new coercive measures available. White citizens' councils. Around the South, particularly in the Deep South, 250,000 members of these white citizens' councils, and they used economic intimidation and political organization and a variety of things, and also maintained kind of wink-wink, nudge-nudge contacts with a revitalized Ku Klux Klan, estimated to number 50,000. And then you had organizations like the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission that was essentially a kind of a star chamber that kept tabs on literally thousands of people who had anything to do with the civil rights movement and came anywhere near Mississippi. And one of the things that they were very good at was looking to see if these people were commies and always finding somebody who would say that they were commies and so on. Now, the strategic task of the civil rights movement looks like this. At the top, you've got the federal government, which has backed, actively or tacitly, the segregationist governments in the South for the better part of 100 years. And then at the bottom, you have, that represents the Negro population of the American South. And then I've got the arrows, pressing down on them with this Jim Crow organization. The strategic task of the civil rights movement looks about like this. Capture the federal government. Get the federal government to turn its power from supporting tacitly or overtly the segregationist government to using federal power against those state governments, to become the ally of the civil rights movement. In other words, what textbooks tend to assume was going on from the outset, the civil rights movement had to achieve through direct action. And it was a complex insurgency, the way we talk about it now, which is to say you had various organizations with different strategies. There was nobody at the top. Martin Luther King is by far the most famous civil rights activist, but he was part of one organization, and there were several others. The NAACP preferred, for instance, legal action. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that is the one associated with Martin Luther King, it began with economic boycotts and moral suasion like the Montgomery bus boycott that most people have heard of. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they resisted any attempts to be subsumed into older organizations, the NAACP or the SCLC, and become kind of the youth arm of those. They had very much their own organizational identity agenda. They specialized in sit-ins, voter registration, political party organization. The Congress on Racial Equality, also sit-ins, freedom rides, community organization. And then the Deacons for Defense was a group very few people have heard of. They were into armed self-defense. I'll talk about them in a bit. But you have these different organizations, and there are rivalries between these organizations and internal and external divisions regarding leadership, strategy, and tactics. What holds them together is a common adversary. And that's it. The key strategy is you're not going to overturn these segregation regimes head on. The key strategy is to control the story. To control the story. To create and sustain a story that would resonate with a wide segment of not just American public opinion beyond the South, but internationally. Because we are in the Cold War. And the segregationists are trying to use that to their advantage, but civil rights activists are also pointing out, and pointing out very effectively, that much of the non-aligned world are persons of color. And the USSR and Red China, were making a great deal of hay out of the fact that there was legal segregation tolerated in the United States and so forth, and they would constantly point at that, and they were winning the propaganda, war, and so the civil rights movement, one of the things that they wanted to do was, to influence, that group, because they knew that the federal government would find it intolerable to allow the face of segregation to be broadcast, so strongly and so sharply to that audience. How do you control the story? How do you get the story told that you want to tell? Force overreactions and make sure the mass media is present to see it. Force overreactions. Show the face of segregation. Show the terror. Show the tyranny of it. And make sure somebody is there to see it. And we think about all the success stories of the civil rights movement that it had in terms of doing this, but it didn't always work. Civil rights historians constantly have told me, don't let your audience not hear about the Albany movement. This is a movement in southwestern Georgia, Albany, in 1962. And this was a flat failure for the civil rights movement. And it illustrates how difficult it could be to coordinate an effective action with competing organizations, because the Albany movement was a situation where you have too many chiefs and too few Indians and different strategies, different tactics, and some people wanted to try to achieve this objective and that objective and the other objective, and they couldn't coordinate, and finally the thing was a whole big mess. So they brought in Martin Luther King, figuring that Martin Luther King could make the whole thing happen because of his charisma and so forth. Flat failure. Why? Albany Police Chief Laurie Pritchett. In terms of waging a counterinsurgency, nobody understood better how to do it than Laurie Pritchett. Because he knew, he understood the game. He understood the game they were playing. He understood the basic tactic was overreaction, so he didn't overreact. And get favorable media coverage, so he made sure that they didn't get favorable media coverage. Why? Because he got favorable media coverage. Ahead of time, one of the civil rights tactics was to overload the jails, and they had this slogan: "Jail, no bail." So that you'd go to jail and you would stay there, and then you would be an expense on the state and a drain and so forth, and you would stay in there. And of course, then the jails would get overcrowded, and so they couldn't keep jailing people and so forth. Well, Pritchett could, because ahead of time he coordinated arrangements with jails, for hundreds of square miles around the county that it was his own responsibility. And so these protesters, they disobeyed laws forbidding, they were marching without a permit, they were doing this, that, or the other, and quietly, respectfully, courteously, he would arrest them, he would put them in paddy wagons, he would send them off to jail, and off to jail, and off to jail, and off to jail. There's no story there. This is a police chief doing his job. And by the way, the media came along, he would talk with them. He'd have beers with them. He would talk with them. And when the bad guys came along, let's see. This, the guy with the attitude there, American Nazi Party stormtrooper. Showed up in Albany, Georgia, wants to create trouble. Why does he have the attitude? Because the police chief, Laurie Pritchett, has just let him know, don't get out of line in my town. Don't mess with anybody. Pritchett was brilliant, at least competent, but brilliant. And he inflicted a major defeat on the civil rights movement. So what are you going to do? And I tell you what, by 1963, the civil rights movement was in trouble, particularly Martin Luther King's part of the Southern Christian leadership, because they needed a win. They needed a big win, especially after that Albany fiasco. So they targeted the city deliberately, scoped it out, reconned it. The city was Birmingham, Alabama. It had everything. Particularly had the Director of Public Security and Bull Connor. Connor, if Pritchett was like the Luke Skywalker of the counterinsurgency, if you want to look at it that way, Connor was a Darth Vader. You need an overreaction? Just show up in Bull Connor's tank. And so, Project C gets underway. Birmingham, April, May 1963. C for confrontation. Birmingham was deliberately targeted. You got Bull Connor, virtually a guarantee of overreaction, and it's still a near-run thing because actually Bull Connor doesn't blow his top right away. And they put protesters in, and the protesters get arrested. And Martin Luther King goes to jail, gets arrested and goes to jail. And he writes that eloquent letter from a Birmingham jail that's become a classic of the civil rights of literature, and it's a beautiful statement and so forth, kind of the Gettysburg Address of the civil rights movement. And it's known well today because Birmingham worked, but it hadn't worked at that point. What happens finally is they throw in the seed corn, they throw in the children, they throw in the youth of Birmingham. Connor's got enough. And in early May, he goes off. You got the police dogs. You got those fire hoses. Those fire hoses they put out 100 pounds of force per square inch, and they can strip bark off of trees at 100 yards. And I don't have any motion picture footage, but these things will knock people right off their feet. All over the country. All over the country. Television programs, newspapers. And the pictures that look kind of grainy here in the New York Times and so forth, but you also have Life magazine. It was a Life magazine photographer who took these things. He got the Pulitzer Prize for taking them. And he got it really close. He shot with a wide-angle lens and so forth. And these are brilliant photographs. And you saw those photographs. I've seen them in the Life magazine. And the sensation you have is you are right there. And there is no way that you can look at those photographs and you can see any excuse for what the police are doing. It is palpably obvious that these people pose no threat. It is palpably obvious that Bull Connor's shock troops are out of control. And it's a huge public relations disaster. And local business elites compelled the city fathers and so forth to broker a deal whereby Birmingham began to desegregate because it was just such a public relations disaster. Here's Time magazine. Bull Connor on the left, again that picture there. Unwittingly, he and his city brought millions of people to the Negroes' side. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that gets you as far as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that only occurs because JFK has the good grace to get himself shot. which is helpful because it's a horrible thing to say, but it gave LBJ, who had better legislative chops than JFK did, put him in the presidency. LBJ really wanted to get the Civil Rights Act passed. He could use the martyrdom of JFK to help get it passed. He was the one who was able to engineer a vote of cloture to stop that filibuster against the Civil Rights Act. And then he's like, that's it, I'm done. Tells Martin Luther King, I told you before, tells Martin Luther King, that's it. Voting Rights Act so that African Americans, Negroes can vote in the South. That's got to wait. White people have got to catch up to what we've already done here. Martin Luther King believes that, if you wait too long, you're going to lose the momentum, and it's not going to go. So you got to get another big win. You've got to force the federal government to do what you want them to do. You've got to compel them. So you need another Bull Connor. There he is. Sheriff Jim Clark. Selma, Alabama. This guy was just nut. This guy actually put himself in the hospital. He got so freaked out about dealing with the Negro menace in his city and so forth. The trouble was he wasn't a force in the city. He was a force in the county. But within Selma itself, he controlled the courthouse. Just so happens that's just the way the law was. And so all the drama that you needed for the civil rights movement had to happen right around the courthouse. Why? Because the guy in front of him, that's Jim Clark in the helmet. The guy in front of him, it's a guy named Baker. And Baker Wilson. And he was a Laurie Pritchett type, which they hadn't counted on. And he was the police chief, and the mayor was more of a Laurie Pritchett type. And they were upset. They were trying to keep Jim Clark in line and so forth. But I tell you what, the civil rights was just, and they got what they wanted. Bloody Sunday, March 1965. Attempted march across the Pettus Bridge, blocked by Jim Clark's forces and state highway patrolmen, and they sort of run amok. It's like a police riot. And even better, not only are the television news crews there to watch the whole thing, but ABC News is broadcasting the evening of this thing, Bloody Sunday, on the evening of this thing, Judgment at Nuremberg. Stanley Kramer film, about Nazi racism and about the complicity of good people in allowing racism. And they cut into this, and for 15 minutes they show footage of Bloody Sunday. And I am not kidding you, hundreds of Americans, white Americans, got in cars, got on planes, got themselves to Selma, Alabama, to support the movement. So the mass media, once again, decisive. And there's a sort of a triumphant march from Selma to Montgomery, and a huge rally on the right in front of the state capitol, once the capital of the Confederacy. And LBJ has to act. And that Voting Rights Act that he said was premature, he got it passed, got it done. And that is the culminating point of the civil rights movement, to use a Clausewitzian culminating. Why? Because within 6 days of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Watts in L.A., the Watts Ghetto in L.A., explodes in flames. What the heck? What is going on with that? Well, it turns out that desegregation and voting rights and so forth don't touch economic injustice, don't touch problems and so forth. And so all of a sudden, white America is looking at, these are National Guardsmen patrolling the streets of Watts. Stokely Carmichael, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, renounces nonviolence, renounces the use of the term Negro, says what we're going to start talking about now is black power. Black power. The term had been around before and so forth, and it had a meaning, and it has a fine meaning related to black pride and so forth, but from the standpoint of trying to influence white America, it was, as Martin Luther King kind of clearly understood, not a good way to go. Because it's at this point, really, that the civil rights movement loses control of the story. And it goes down from there. Martin Luther King decides that justice is all of a piece, and that as he's first and foremost a preacher. And so he begins to speak out against economic injustice and also against the Vietnam War, which he sees as an immoral war that is diverting billions of dollars that could be spent and needed to be spent to rectify equities at home. King was also very concerned about the ways in which Americans solved problems with violence. And he really believed that nonviolence was not just a tactic, it was a principle. But this also alienated plenty of people. Even people who were otherwise sympathetic thought he was using bad judgment. And then finally, you get the organization of the Black Panther Party, which best known from Oakland, California, but actually originates in Lowndes County, Alabama. And you look at these images, and they really suggest something, I think, about the contingency that's involved with the civil rights movement. Because imagine if any of these images had cropped up at an earlier point, before the civil rights movement had gotten momentum, before it had captured the federal government's power and so on. You don't necessarily get the outcome that we all think is inevitable. Had these developments occurred earlier, it could have destroyed the momentum of the civil rights movement. You could have seen the prolongation of an American system of apartheid the same way that happened in South Africa until the 1990s, as an illustration of a possible alternative outcome. You might even have seen a real insurgency, a Rhodesia-style insurgency. And by the way, segregationists thought in terms of this, saw themselves as being in the same situation as whites in South Africa, in the same situation as whites in Rhodesia. And in terms of, and you might have seen these men come to the fore much sooner or much more strongly. Robert F. Williams, no relation to the commandant of the War College, as far as I know. But Robert F. Williams, as early as 1961, he revitalizes a chapter of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. And it's an NAACP chapter with a difference: they're all armed, they all got guns. And in his town, there are sit-ins, and guess what? The kids who are in the sit-ins don't get messed with. Why? Because everybody knows there's Robert F. Williams in town. He's got guns. Doesn't use them, but he's there. He's not into nonviolence. He's into the right of self-defense. Oh, Martin Luther King, who's into nonviolence and so forth, took him a while to get there. Certainly believe in nonviolence as a tactic by which to promote change and so forth, but I mean, his house got bombed in Montgomery. So guess what? He had a gun in his house. He had armed guards outside his house. If you see pictures of his house, you see searchlights, looking at him. This is a guy who believed early on that, of course, you have a right of self-defense. And as Bayard Rustin, another civil rights strategist, who basically says, if you're going to go nonviolent, you've got to go consistently. And actually, so the civil rights movement really buries the idea that there are guns involved, that there are self-defense groups involved, that there are Robert F. Williams. And Williams himself gets in trouble with the law, one of these lawfare things, flees to Cuba, writes a book called Negroes with Guns that is an account of his self-defense efforts in North Carolina. It is disagreements with nonviolence as a philosophy, and it becomes very influential within the civil rights movement, where the younger group, Stokely Carmichael among them, are getting more and more impatient with the idea of being hit and struck and so forth, and not fighting back only with nonviolence. And this eventuates in self-defense groups, the largest and best known of which were the Deacons for Defense and Justice, organized in Bogalusa, Louisiana, with chapters in Louisiana and Mississippi. These are heavily comprised of World War II and Korean War veterans with a good understanding of tactics, good understanding of command and control. They started off with rifles and shotguns, standardized over time to M1 carbines and 38 specials. Logisticians in the room, any idea why? The lecture cannot continue until someone responds. Supply. Yeah. Easier, standardize the ammo. 30 caliber for the M1s, 38 specials for the 38 special handguns and so forth. Stories that they had automatic weapons and hand grenades. These guys were actually very well versed in firearms laws and probably didn't. Oh, but they were very well versed in other things too, like the National Rifle Association gave them a lot of the ammunition. They applied for it. The NRA gave it to them because that's what the NRA used to do and still does, I guess. And these guys fought back. KKK incursions in their communities met with fusillades of gunfire. They exercised a protective umbrella over nonviolent civil rights movement organizers, and they wound up protecting Martin Luther King and other civil rights movement activists when they continued James Meredith's so-called March Against Fear in 1966, when Meredith was going to march from Memphis down to Jackson, Mississippi, and he got shot a few yards on the Mississippi side of the state line, and Martin Luther King and other people. This is one of the last great hurrahs in which all the civil rights organizations did something together. They completed the march, and they did it with protection from the Deacons for defense. There's actually, and again, this hidden history is now coming to light. There's actually a pretty good movie. Came out a few years ago called Deacons for Defense. Forrest Whitaker is in it. It's really rather well done, and I commend it to your attention. Okay. I've been talking for quite a while. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed talking about it, but I need to wind this thing up. Why it was an insurgency, I hope by now you understand why it was. Why it matters. Even if one ultimately decides that the civil rights movement was not an insurgency, and personally I find the case for insurgency compelling, it's a valuable intellectual exercise. In my field, academic military history is a young field, and we need to understand for ourselves what the intellectual boundaries of our field ought to be. And the traditional concerns of military history are important. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that they were important. But it's also useful to have a sense of those boundaries. And finding the proper boundaries involves an understanding of what is just on the other side of the boundaries. And so even if you come down to the idea that this is not really an insurgency, the intellectual exercise, I think, is very, very useful in terms of an expanded understanding of the cognitive terrain of military history. It's also useful as a homegrown example of a complex insurgency. In fact, I would say a homegrown example of something that Colonel Thomas Hammes, The Sling of the Stone, assures us is of much more recent vintage, what he calls fourth-generation warfare. Talks about fourth-generation warfare as being a kind of warfare that uses all the available networks, political, economic, social, and military, to convince the enemy's political decision-makers that their strategic goals are either unachievable or too costly for the perceived benefit. This is an evolved form of insurgency. And he says that it makes use of society's networks to carry on the fight. And unlike previous generations, it does not attempt to win by defeating the enemy's military forces. Instead, via the networks, it directly attacks the minds of enemy decision-makers to destroy the enemy's political will. It says fourth-generation wars are lengthy, measured in decades rather than months or years. Arguably, this insurgency I'm talking about didn't start in 1955. It may have started as long ago as the tail end of the 19th century and took the better part of a century to occur. But it is fourth-generation warfare. It has a political front. There are African Americans in the North who are able to vote and who are able to put pressure on local political city machines, and that gives you some leverage within the political realm. They have legal access to the federal court system. They take advantage of that. That leverages the federal government, but not much. They use economic warfare. They use boycotts. Economic boycotts against Southern merchants and so forth. They also use the bad publicity of activism and so forth to hurt segregation of the South economically in another way too. Coca-Cola had its headquarters in Atlanta. And Coca-Cola had no particular brief for civil rights, but Coca-Cola assured the city fathers of Atlanta that their interests were worldwide and that millions of their customers were persons of color And that if there was any trouble in Atlanta, like in Birmingham, like in other, they were going to move their headquarters. And so you have that going on as well. Socially, you have the use of direct action to generate self-respect, to create mass organization and activity. The mass media, as I've shown, is central to the achievement of this. This is networking in an almost literal sense, to influence the minds of bystanders, to say people outside the fight, people who don't think about segregation, white Americans living elsewhere, people living all over the world, and to change the image of Negroes as docile and or dangerous to courageous and principled, and to use a rhetoric that very much is redolent with an ethos of civic nationalism rather than racial nationalism, and they're able to move that to the center of the American vision. Military, they force the federal government to bring its military power to bear against the states, either with regular troops, as sometimes occurred, or the federalization of the Army National Guard. And it is the minds of enemy decision makers that are indeed targeted, federal as well as state and local, because they consistently pushed back presidential counsel to wait by creating conditions that made presidents see that waiting was too costly for the perceived benefit. And the last reason it matters, really, I think, is because at the end of the day, I'm not a military historian, I'm a historian. It's my job to understand the human past. And at the end of the day, I think understanding the civil rights movement as an insurgency enables us to understand the civil rights movement better. It enables to see this sit-in, Jackson, Mississippi, 1963, for what it is. A battle. It's part of a war. And those people sitting at that counter as warriors. Warriors of an exceptional kind. Warriors that I tell my students back at Ohio State are really the distillation of all that is best in the warrior ethos. Thanks very much for your attention. I know I've been talking for quite a long time. I hope that you enjoyed it very much. I look forward to your questions, and if you just want to go and enjoy the rest of the evening, that's okay with me too. But
my name is Charles Stone. I think what makes it so hard for me, anyway, to think of it as an insurgency is that I'm sort of looking at people in the civil rights movement that want the same thing I want, be American. Whereas now, insurgency to me is like a whole other culture coming in trying to move you out or something. But when you really look at it, there's those people that just want to eat in a restaurant or whatever, be a normal American. And I think that's what confuses at least me about it being an insurgency.
And I think that that's a very good point. And you have to look at it from the point of view of white Southerners, growing up in that time, because as reasonable as these demands were, and they were entirely reasonable. To white Southerners, and I grew up in sort of the tail end of legal segregation in North Carolina, so I remember this. It is astonishing the degree to which this kind of thing was just considered to be beyond the pale, as if the stars were all on fire, as if something that you had a constant had changed. And so you have to look at it from the standpoint of those who opposed it. The other thing about it too, and then I'll move on, is Martin Luther King very presciently said that it didn't cost America a dime to desegregate lunch counters and to give African Americans a vote. It was going to cost them billions to achieve economic justice, and that just never got off the ground. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of points. The first is you mentioned some of the organizations, and if you could touch on the role of the church, but more broadly the role of religion. I know Dr. King was a minister, but I think that religion played a key role. The other thing is, in terms of the white South, because really I think this really has to do a lot with the states. I mean, A lot of the actions in Alabama, Mississippi was cited any number of times, but other states, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, you mentioned Texas and Louisiana, there was far at the how do I put this, at the national level, if you will, I mean, there was far less attention the role of those governors that seemed to be, for lack of a better word, more moderate in terms of looking at civil rights. I mean, we don't have the same sort of situation in North Carolina or even South Carolina with the integration of the universities there. And the last point, with regards to the culminating point, 1965, I think I agree with it in terms of at the national level, but I think for most African Americans in the South, most of the gains, if you will, of the civil rights movement really not until the 1970s. Just, again, three kind of diverse points, but if you could comment on those.
Let me see if, those are good points, and let me see if I can deal with them briefly. One of the things that's most striking to me about the different organizations and their approaches is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is composed, principally of ministers, and the religious element and the nonviolent component, I think, is the richest there. And in the early stages, their basic tactic of nonviolent resistance was to withdraw from the segregationist sphere. You think about the Montgomery bus boycott, for instance. That's actually a withdrawal of economic activity by the African American community from businesses and transportation companies and so forth that rely on that business, and that was the way they put pressure. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, on the other hand, they used nonviolence, but what they did was they intruded themselves into the segregationist sphere with the famous sit-ins, the Woolworth lunch counters and so forth. And by the way, the first Woolworth sit-in is in Greensboro, North Carolina, and that becomes the prototype for sit-ins that take place by the hundreds. So that's I guess the first element. The second bit about what goes on in different states and so on. Different states try different strategies for defeating desegregation, for instance. Virginia tries it by simply flushing their public school system, in several counties, and try that as a tactic, and they discover that it doesn't really work out terribly well. And so what actually happens de facto is that in the Upper South in particular, what you get is all of a sudden private schools that receive state support. And so you are able to to continue a segregated school system in that kind of way. And you're right. It's like the culminating point of the movement in terms of the advances that it's able to gain and secure, civil rights and voting rights. They secure those rights, but it takes time for them to really play out. And you're right, school integration doesn't really get going until about 1970, and it takes time for voting to eventuate in large numbers of African American office holders and so on. And although in the eyes of whites, once again, blacks seem dangerous and off-putting and so forth. I remember being scandalized myself when, as an 8-year-old, I look at looking at the Summer Olympics in Mexico City, and I see the track and field winners, the gold and silver medalists, raising with their heads down and raising the Black Power salute, and I was just I admired Martin Luther King, and so I didn't admire that. But that's a white person looking at that. Black, African American person, that's about pride. That's about finding your culture. That is about saying no to, and this is a word I have not used tonight, and I will not use it again, but it needs to be used in this context. That is about saying no to the idea of being a nigger. And that mattered. That was important and continued to be as well. And so that's something that, so in one sense a culminating point in terms of the insurgency, but in terms of this larger bit, I'd say it was a struggle that went on and continues to do so. Yeah.
In your opinion, which anti-civil rights group was the most dangerous, define dangerous? Which pro-civil rights movement group was the most effective, define effective? And why, among all those groups and all those leaders, did King rise to the top?
Okay. Yeah.
I'm getting my money's worth out of this question.
I think it's a very good question. I think that the most dangerous opponent of the civil rights movement was not Ross Barnett. It was not Della Beckwith, who shot Medgar Evers, and it wasn't Governor Ross Barnett, who came and pointedly shook the hand of Della Beckwith at his trial for killing Medgar Evers. I think the most dangerous opponent of the civil rights movement was Laurie Pritchett. And I think that historians of the civil rights movement generally recognize that he was dangerous. He was dangerous precisely because he was on to their game. Laurie Pritchett, the police chief of Albany, Georgia. Laurie Pritchett, who all he did was enforce the law. You know, wasn't necessarily a law he agreed with. He didn't even go by it. He just enforced the law. People were protesting without a permit. They were violating city ordinances and state laws about going into restaurants and so forth, and he simply arrested them and sent them off to jail courteously, respectfully. This thing depends. The success of the civil rights movement depends on the mass media being present and having a story and having the right story. So John Lewis, the first black congressman in Georgia since Reconstruction, talked about the impact of having reporters around. He said the only time when he was doing a direct action that he felt safe was when there were reporters present. And the reporters are only going to be present if they think there's a story. And Pritchett didn't give them a story. So in terms of somebody who I think was the best foe, I think Pritchett is it. The most effective civil rights organization, I would say, actually, is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. The reason is that Martin Luther King was a great rhetorician and a wonderful sort of public face for the civil rights movement, and a spellbinding speaker and so on, but not always the best tactician, not always the best strategist. And it was actually SNCC, I think, whose effectiveness in their sit-in tactics and their support of the Congress of Racial Equality with the freedom rides and so forth forced King to take the next step, because Birmingham, that happens in 1963, and that is, 7 years after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott. And Birmingham is the first time that, in effect, Martin Luther King takes the initiative, goes on the offensive. Because up until this time, he's been responding to things. He responded to the arrest of Rosa Parks for not wanting to sit in the back. And he responded to other kinds of things. But Birmingham is the thing that propels him forward. And it's SNCC that I think that forces him to move forward if he's going to be the leader. It's like Gandhi's famous expression, there go my people. I must hurry up to catch them because I'm their leader. And so there's that. And why did King, I think, rise to the top and so forth? Because he was a brilliant American prophet, and better, I think, than anybody else at expressing what the civil rights movement was all about.
You make a powerful argument for the civil rights movement being an insurgency. How would you describe the means of coordination among the various disparate groups, and could you point to an intellectual G3, if you will, who maintained the focus throughout the campaign?
Yeah, they didn't have one. And in fact, if there was, honestly, it's funny. I mean, morally and so forth, I'm, obviously, I think everybody in here, was glad the civil rights movement, won the day or got as far as it did. But I'm looking at this basically as a military problem, And militarily, there were things about the civil rights movement you could really have exploited. And I've already identified one, but you put your finger on the other, because there was no single directed head. And you might think it was Martin Luther King and so forth, but people got tired of Martin Luther King. They began to call him, toward the end, they began to call him the Lord, in a disparaging kind of a way. Eventually, most civil rights movements organizations broke with the idea of nonviolence. You're dealing with huge egos involved with this. So these are, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP had been fighting segregation for his entire life, and the idea that he was going to move over and let Martin Luther King, be the undisputed, the limelight and so forth. No, not necessarily. Stokely Carmichael, there's an interesting conversation that the media is filming and so forth, where Carmichael is walking down the road. It's 1966, and he's talking about black power, and he is he's spouting a new ideology, and he was doing it in a way that was very different in rhetorical style from King's, but just as effective. And then King over here is also walking along and so forth, and quietly trying to reframe what Carmichael is saying. And these are clear rivals. We're also talking about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Those are the traditional dichotomy and so forth. But there's Stokely Carmichael and King as well, and other leaders. And so there is no central direction. No. And these organizations, had frictions because of leadership, frictions because of different ideas about the strategies and tactics that were appropriate at a given time. And rather than just saying, they all must be infiltrated by communists and so forth, but come on, give me a break. Better. If you're going to do some good counterintelligence work and so forth, exploit the divisions. Rather than send the tapes to to Martin Luther King saying you ought to off yourself because you've been sleeping with women and your wife's going to find out and so forth. Send tapes of him saying bad things about Roy Wilkins. I mean, just there were ways if you wanted to get at the civil rights movement, to destroy it, to defeat it, that you could have done. And I think it's actually important to recover that part of it, because otherwise we do not understand fully the achievement of the civil rights movement in gaining this victory. We tend to think of it as inevitable when it is not. I have a hand up over here. Oh, okay, we have a hand. Okay, here and then back.
What can we learn from this for the insurgencies that we're currently fighting or will fight in the future?
It's a good question, and it's actually a question that I think I will have to get to for real at another time, because tonight I felt like I wound up having to spend so much time simply demonstrating that this was an insurgency. But if it is an insurgency, it is an example of what Thomas Hammonds calls a fourth generation warfare, what others have called complex insurgency, and it has some of the hallmarks of this. I have an officer. I know of an officer. I have non-attribution policy, so it's just an officer who's out there in space somewhere, who isn't sure. He was a combat veteran of Iraq, and wasn't sure that Iraq's an insurgency, because it doesn't look like an insurgency the way he was taught to understand insurgency. Well, we're trying to understand those kinds of insurgencies that are going on, but these are insurgencies people who have a different language, different culture, different religion. The cognitive terrain is difficult. What makes the civil rights movement a useful tool, if we choose to use it as such, is this is homegrown. This culture we understand. It is we ourselves. The veterans of it are still alive. The records are available. We want to drill down and look at this kind of insurgency, in a very complex, nuanced, textured. What's the military speak word I'm looking for here? There's some cool military speak word that's involved with it. Granularity. There it is. Granularity. Okay, this thing has a lot of granularity going for it. So I tell you what, come to the joint pub sometime, and we'll get into this, because you've raised the issue that I'd like very much in this environment to explore. But first, I've got to get it on the table as an issue, which, believe me, was a little bit of a tough sell to start with. And by the way, I'm teaching an elective course on American insurgencies that deals with political violence of Reconstruction and the civil rights movement, both as examples of insurgencies, and we'll have a chance to explore it in there. But it is a terrific question, and it might even be who knows? I might even get a book out of it. So, okay. There's a question I think behind you. Who's next? You got the microphone, right?
You said someone's ahead.
Oh, somebody's ahead. Okay.
Right.
Oh, over here on that side. Okay. Can I take off my coat? Would that be all right? Okay. All right.
You talked about the nonviolent movement as part of this insurgency, and until your last response didn't mention pretty much the violent part, and Malcolm X and Farrakhan and their role in the civil rights movement, and how do you see them fitting into that insurgency?
I'm glad you caught me with that one. I'm glad you caught that, because that's an important point that I just about did entirely omit, and I think it's crucial. It's not as though segregationists just laid down and died after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of '65 or the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I mean, these people could look back at having beaten 2 constitutional amendments and any amount of federal legislation in the Reconstruction era, and they were experts at knowing how to sort of defang legislation, and they continued to assault, intimidate, kill African Americans who were attempting to exercise their rights. So what gets them to stop? It's not that they suddenly see sweet reason. It is that they see Farrakhan, Malcolm X, Black Power, and they also see, and this is something we're beginning now to really understand, on the ground, near their communities and so forth, self-defense groups, the Deacons for Defense and other civil organizations, but particularly the Deacons for Defense, combat veterans who right now are using those weapons in self-defense. But if you don't cut a deal with the nice guys, Martin Luther Kings, the other nonviolent types, and their representatives at the state and at the local level, then you're going to have to deal sooner or later with what's behind door number 2. And you don't want to deal with what's behind door number 2. And so there's really 2 kinds of leverage going on here. There is the leverage provided by the nonviolent movement and so forth, which is what I've talked about mostly tonight. And then there is the leverage provided by credible threat. And here, too, we're getting back into the realm of war, because war doesn't always consist of the application of violence. Sometimes it consists of the threat of violence. And the Deacons for Defense definitely had that threat in a way that was credible. And I think in terms of the settlements that occur at the community level in the Deep South, they are a significant factor in that. And I think the more we research that, the more we're finding that out. Thanks. That's a great question.
2 more, sir, over there.
I just wanted to raise the issue of, I wouldn't want people to leave here with thinking that these different civil rights groups were, at each other's throats all the time. I think it's really important, and with your insurgency kind of side of things, is that they found incredible ways to work together. And it was because, in some ways, they were so deeply principled and deeply committed for many times Christian ethical kinds of values that they found their way to get over their differences. And they were beaten and they were jailed together and they were imprisoned together and humiliated together. And so I think that's particularly, at least through 1965, it's important to see what incredible cooperation there was, as well as, the seeds of their own self-destruction.
Right, and I'm not even sure that I would say that it's exactly self-destruction that eventuates. Something certainly changes. Maybe it had to change. Again, Clausewitz talks about culminating point. Even if you're winning a victory, there comes a point where you sort of run out of gas. With these organizations, what keeps them together is, as you say, I mean, there are these frictions that go on throughout the civil rights movement, but but they are, they're on the battlefield together, and they learn from each other. It is the Congress of Racial Equality, actually, that pioneers the sit-in. It's the Greensboro students who were in SNCC read a Congress of Racial Equality pamphlet and initiate the sit-ins. The sit-in then spreads and becomes a generalized tactic. It is the Congress of Racial Equality that begins the freedom rides, but those are taken over by SNCC. So they adopt each other's tactics and so forth. The freedom schools are in Mississippi in 1964 are a common tactic as well. And there's also another element of this while we're sort of acquiring a more nuanced understanding of what's going on is, there are also substantial number of whites who were part of the civil rights movement, to include Southern whites, and they are an element of the movement that really can't be forgotten either. And there were courageous Southern newspaper editors and publishers and so forth who kept this story going before the national media picked it up. And some of the very best reporters who were able to get in the closest and so forth were men, mostly men. We're not dealing with too many women in this particular time, who were themselves Southerners. 2 of the very best reporters from North Carolina and Alabama. I think the fellow who took the Pulitzer Prize-winning photographs was a Southerner. They understood the lay of the land, and they were able to get closer to the story as a result. So it's not just a matter of blacks versus versus whites. There are also whites of goodwill involved within the movement and also reporting on the movement as well.
First, I want to compliment you on your body of work.
Thank you.
I'm glad I came tonight. Wouldn't have missed it. I'm going to relay an experience to you,
Okay.
and I want you to put it in some type of context for me.
All right.
And then I want you to relate it to what you just presented.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
I came back on emergency leave in the late 60s. I went to Washington, D.C., and lo and behold, I arrived when the city's burning. I go home to my parents' house in Baltimore, Maryland, a southern state at that time, very different from what it is today. And Baltimore is burning. The governor of Maryland comes on the television set. His name just happened to be Agnew, and said, we're going to enforce the law. What's happening? And how's that relate to the civil rights movement?
Sure. Yeah. What is happening? And this is something that Martin Luther King began to realize himself, because he asked himself that question when Watts exploded. What's happening, of course, is that racism was just a southern problem. It's a national problem. There wasn't legal segregation in the North, but there had been for years de facto segregation. And there were tremendous economic inequalities, that were simply just the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act didn't come close to touching these things. And so it was widely thought, because people wrap their heads around it, was widely thought that what was going on here, was, Langston Hughes has a poem about, what happens to a dream deferred, or does it explode? Well, Summertime was, these were explosions. And King then, in some of his final campaigns, King goes not to the South but to Chicago, and in Chicago discovers, a level of hostility. This is Chicago can teach people in Mississippi how to hate. These folks know how to do it. So there's plenty of racism there, and up there was a very strong sense of that economically, in terms of opportunity and so forth, there was going to be a zero-sum game, and so you have then, I think, as near as I can understand it, these riots being a response really to just the tremendous frustration of an America that has been confronted as directly as it can with its own shadow, its own darkness. And still, to the extent that it can redline, to the extent that it can finesse, to the extent that it can still keep the country divided, to the extent that it can still, if it doesn't say the word, the N-word outright, it's still, infuriating. Absolutely infuriating. And two things, and then we need to quit for the evening, but this is something I'll thought to leave you with. One of the things that African American historians and scholars and so forth wonder about is whether because they believe that America is still a racist society this day. We have a president who's African American, and we've had African American office holders for years and so forth. And yet you look at how this country is divided, who's in jail, who's not, where the inequities and so forth, and the racial component is extreme. But we get back to this business about this, the struggle for the control of the story. Well, maybe the struggle for control of the story has fallen into the hands of people who believe in the persistence of racism, not as a matter of racial hatred, but as a matter of the preservation of white privilege status for Americans. And maybe they've got control of the story, and maybe the very triumph of the civil rights movement is an important component of that story, because it's like, heck, racism? There's no racism anymore. There was racism, but the triumph of the civil rights movement destroyed racism. And so that dog won't hunt anymore. The inequities and so forth that we still see, you can't lay them at the door of racism anymore. So if this is ultimately an insurgency that is about getting control of the story and of influencing and so forth, then maybe the counterinsurgents at the end of the day sort of retrenched, found a rhetoric, found a way to kind of keep the old ball game going in a new guise, maybe. We'll have to leave it there, I guess, for tonight.
we have something for you. If you can just hang on here. Well, Mark, 6 years ago, we all thought we understood what an insurgency was. And then we saw one, and we've seen it for quite a while, and we've continued to study at whatever level we are about what insurgency means and who are insurgents and how we do counterinsurgency. But this has given us an entirely different perspective on both of those terms. Different perspective that I'd venture to guess that most of us never even thought of before we came tonight. We ask our speakers in this series, above all else, to enlighten us, entertain us, and make us think. And boy, have you made us think tonight. We really appreciate all you've done, and we'd like to present a reduced copy of your poster.
Thank you.
On behalf of Colonel Rob D'Alessandro, the director of AHEC, and all our staff, thank you very much, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really enjoyed it. Before you go, there's one thing I really want to thank you for, and that is I'm at the very beginning of this project, and you have done a wonderful and graceful thing for me tonight, which is that you have encouraged me, you have asked questions that have been thoughtful and constructive and have moved me forward. And I tell you what, honest to God, I am a refugee right now from academia, the groves of academia, and I am finding that in many respects the Army War College and the institutions co-located for it are far more intellectually alive and interesting and open to new ideas than what I find back on the block in academia. And so I thank you very much for that.